Government departments in Argentina have been hit hard by another wave of layoffs, all in the name of cost cutting, and human rights and press freedoms have come under pressure once again. Meanwhile, some voices within the government are suggesting a revisionist review of Argentine history. Despite the Libertarian government's self-proclaimed love of freedom, Milei's hard-right version seems tempered with a hefty dose of good old-fashioned authoritarianism. Last Friday saw a fresh wave of government layoffs. Particularly hit was what remains of the Women, Genders and Diversity Ministry, which has now lost 85% of its staff. The ministry, which had already lost that status, used to focus on such issues as gender-based violence and femicide. The ministry existed to help survivors escape violent situations and offer psychological, legal and financial support to victims. What's left of the ministry will now be repurposed as the Family Protection Directorate, with a less specific remit of protecting all Argentines from violence and risk situations. Whatever its new purpose, what remains of the ministry is now running on a shoestring budget and is said to be severely understaffed. Other hard-hit departments were the Social Development Secretariat, the Industrial Technology National Institute, the National Parks Administration, the Human Rights Secretariat and the National Film Institute. Most government workers are hired on temporary contracts, so the layoffs have been achieved by simply not renewing contracts as they expire. A similar strategy was used in the waves of layoffs earlier in the year. An estimated 5,000 workers lost their jobs over the weekend, and the numbers were said to include pregnant women and people on long-term sick leave. Since December, there's been a block on all state bodies from hiring new staff on any kind of contract. While the stated intention is to cut back on overstaffing and reduce state spending by removing what are seen as unnecessary departments, the act seems to be very selective about where it falls. The ability to report on what the government is up to is coming under assault, with moves being made against the media. Earlier in the year, the Telam state news agency was temporarily shut down and the 700 employees placed on extended leave, many of whom have now taken voluntary redundancy. I made a video a few months ago going into more detail about the Telam closure. You can find the link at the top of the screen. Telam is now due to reopen as an advertising agency, and what remains of its staff will be transferred to other public media organisations. Also back in March, TV Publica, the state television channel, had its budget slashed and most programming has now been abandoned. Content and news have come under heavy censorship, with the number of daily newscasts cut from 4 to only 2. There was no coverage of this year's Day of Memory, Truth and Justice. On International Women's Day back in March, interviews with protesters or feminist group leaders were not permitted. And there is a ban on any news that even mentions the names of union and social movement leaders. Despite all this, the channel manages to limp along, but it could be up for sale in the coming wave of privatisations. Also last week, the Ministry of Human Capital backtracked on a decision to force all journalists to be registered. This would have meant reinstating a law from 1947 that restricted the freedom of expression and was repealed in the 1980s after the restoration of democracy. These attacks on press freedom seem like something one would expect in communist China, rather than from a libertarian government which claims to hold freedom as a guiding principle. The wave of layoffs has also hit the Human Rights Secretariat. Part of the remit of this body is administration of the National Memory Archive and the Register of Victims of State Terrorism. Basically, it looks after matters regarding the actions of the brutal 1976 to 83 military dictatorship and the so-called Dirty War. A lot of issues from that time remain unresolved, but during the Kirchner government in the early 2000s, there was an attempt to give a certain amount of closure to victims' families. Government departments were set up to investigate and research, and many of the aging generals and torturers were finally put on trial, convicted and sent to prison. While accurate figures are difficult to ascertain, the generally accepted figure of Argentine citizens tortured and killed by the military government is around 30,000. The new Vice President, Victoria Villarruel, comes from a military family background and is said to have spent time visiting these old military men in prison. She disputes the accepted narrative and claims the statistics are inflated. She says that the trials were politically motivated and some cases should be re-examined. The Vice President has stated that terrorists who fought against the government and also kidnapped and killed were never held to account for their crimes because of their connections with the left-wing Kirchner government. Recently, the government stated that many monuments to the disappeared occupy valuable real estate, land which could be cleared and repurposed or sold off to investors and developers. Thanks for watching. If you like this latest video, please give it a like. And if you're not already subscribed but want to see more content like this, just click on the button. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee in the link below. And until next time, que tengas un buen día.